My name is Ian Whittle. I'm the younger son of Frank Whittle. He pulled off this achievement really because he was like a bulldog.
One of my colleagues sat me on the back. He said, "Frank, it flies." And in the tension of the moment, I rather rudely said, "That was bloody well what it was designed to do, isn't it?"
Whittle was clearly a genius. He could see the future at a time when other people couldn't.
I don't think a lot of people realise that that first flight marks the dawn of the jet age.
To be studying aero engineering at Cambridge, like my great-grandfather, is really special. Hearing the name Whittle around this university really reminds me of how much of an impact he continues to have.
He was an amazing man. He was very, very tough, and he kept going. Every single stage of the project was such a battle.
He thought, well, what his contribution would be a jet aircraft for the RAF to use to fight the Hun.
It is possible that the Battle of Britain could have been avoided if Britain had, say, Gloucester meteors by May 1940.
Oh, it was frustration after frustration, and it took its toll. I began to have a series of nervous breakdowns.
A lot of these things may have caused the rather gentle breakdown of his marriage to Mother. I suddenly found I didn't have a daddy at home. When he found out that I was converting to fly the Meteor, he didn't really like it. He was worried. He thought his silly little boy would probably kill himself.
Millions of livelihoods depend on aviation every day, and that is because of Frank Whittle.
When I see what's happened in the way of civil aviation, I can only say it's extremely satisfying.
We face the challenge of reaching net zero carbon by 2050, and it's going to take a new generation of engineers with the same persistence and ingenuity of Whittle if we're going to get there.
My father wasn't in the least bit interested in being referred to as the inventor of the turbojet. He never put a line underneath anything he ever did, because he was always looking into the future all the time. He was always thinking of ways of making it better.
It's late September. Time to fly. For Ian Whittle, nothing could be more exhilarating. And today's destination has added significance for this son of a jet pioneer.
I'm still flying. I still have a flying license and an instrument rating, so I still get associated with aircraft, and thanks to my dad that I do.
Easy, take us straight to the first runway 27 and report at 5 miles, QFE 1019. 1019 and QFE 1022 QNH at 45 miles, go empty.
I must say I do look back with a huge sense of gratitude to him for what he achieved and what he enabled me to do. We're in the Jet Age Museum. This place does celebrate my father's work. There's no doubt about that. And I'm standing in front of an airplane, or it's a replica of an airplane called the E-2839. It was Britain's first jet aircraft. It was powered by the Whittle W1 engine for its first flights, and then subsequently some of the more powerful engines. It led to a huge step change in aeronautics. It thrills me to be in front of this aeroplane because of the family connection.
Coventry, a cathedral city, and the place where Frank Whittle was born on the 1st of June 1907, seen here with baby brother Albert. His family lived in a terraced house, a short distance from the city centre. A small plaque is all that marks the birthplace of one of the world's most influential engineers. In later life, he returned, never forgetting where it all began.
I lived there in Coventry for 9 years, went to an elementary school there. My parents were working class. My father was a foreman in machine tool manufacturers. And then the family moved to Leamington Spa because my father bought a small engineering outfit called the Leamington Valve and Piston Ring Company. And I really did get my first engineering experiences there because I helped him sometimes for, I think it was about twopence an hour or something like that, making slots in valve stems.
World War I introduced mechanical warfare on a colossal scale, but it provided considerable work for heavy industry. It's likely that the business run by Moses Whittle, Frank's father, would have been awarded contracts to support the war effort. However, with the end of war came the end of contracts.
The end of the First World War in 1918, the business lost out and Grandpa became very poor. They did have hard times, but I don't know much about it. I can only say that at one time they had nowhere really to sleep except in the workshop on the floor, and times were very tough.
Do you think that affected your father?
I shouldn't think it affected him particularly, no. Why should it?
Frank Whittle was born at a time of intense excitement in flying, pursued by legendary pioneers such as Louis Blériot in France and the Wright brothers in America. The young Whittle was captivated.
I was always attracted to flying from my earliest years almost. When I was 4, my favourite toy, and this was 1911, was a tin model of a Blériot. And my heroes were people like Captain Albert Ball and Major McCudden on the VCs of the First World War, and I just wanted to fly. I was very lazy with homework and got a series of raspberries for that. But at the end of term, I would often do quite well. For instance, I'd come top of maths. I used to go down to the library in Leamington Spa and study all sorts of things which are not in the school curriculum. And that was where I first started to learn about gas turbines.
Armed with his love of flying and a gift for maths, at the age of 15, he applied to join the Royal Air Force. However, he was rejected, not because of his age, but because of his height.
I was sunk for the time being, but before I left the camp, a very kindly physical training sergeant, if you can imagine such a thing, took pity on me, and he gave me a diet to follow and a series of exercises, Max Alding exercises. I did all that for 6 months. I put on 3 inches on height and 3 inches on my chest. So I thought, well, I'll have another shot. And I wrote to the ministry, but they said, no, once you've been turned down, you've been turned down forever. And there seemed to be no hope. So I thought, well, I'd go through the whole process again as though I'd never happened, in the hope that the bureaucracy wouldn't pick it up. And I was lucky that time. I got through both the written exam again and the medical and ended up at Cranwell in number 4 wing.
That was the thing about him. If he decided he was going to do something, he'd practically go over the top doing it. And he must have driven his mother potty because he was trying to put on weight, trying to put on height, and he's growing out. He was the eldest of the children. There were 4 of them. And so he was growing out of all his clothes, so they had to buy new clothes for him, and of course they had to feed him. And they were poor. They were working class poor people in Coventry. Nevertheless, he put on the necessary, and he became in the end 5'7" tall, which is not very tall, but it was tall enough for the Royal Air Force to accept him.
Whittle began as an apprentice at RAF Cranwell in Lincolnshire, but this would never lead to a flying role. However, his outstanding skill at making model aircraft singled him out as a potential officer. The founder of the RAF, Lord Trenchard, had his doubts, but was persuaded by Whittle's commanding officer to reconsider because
he thought that he'd got a mathematical genius.
And so in 1926, Whittle began officer training, proving himself an excellent pilot. But he wanted to fly much faster than a piston engine and propeller would allow and started thinking of alternatives. It began with a student thesis.
All cadets had to write a thesis, and I chose future developments in aircraft design, rather ambitious, and rather concentrated on the engine side, But the main thing in that thesis was that I arrived at what I now know was the well-known Breguet formula. I wasn't familiar with it at the time, connecting speed, range, engine efficiency and so forth. And to me that meant that if you wanted to go very fast and far, you would have to go very high, heights of 50,000 feet, that sort of thing, at heights where the piston engine obviously wouldn't work, and at speeds which where the propeller wouldn't work. So I started to look for a new kind of power plant.
At the time, the maximum speed of RAF fighters, like the Gloucester Gamecock, was 160 miles per hour, with a flying limit of 27,000 feet.
I considered a piston engine driving a fan inside a hollow fuselage, and then thought, well, why not throw that piston engine away, up the compression ratio of the fan, and substitute a turbine for the piston engine? And there was the turbojet.
Whittle's work didn't go unnoticed, and the RAF helped arrange a meeting with Dr. Alan Griffiths, one of Britain's top scientists, who had himself started to consider gas turbines for propeller-driven aircraft.
Griffith pointed out an error in my calculations, and it was all rather depressing, you know. And then after that, I got a letter from the Air Ministry saying, in effect, that they weren't really interested and so forth.
Hesitancy towards radical ideas was something that had dogged aviation since the beginning of powered flight, led by the Wright brothers, as one of the American pioneers from that time recalls.
The Wrights had offered to demonstrate their airplane to the United States Army shortly after their first successful flights. The Army declined, preferring to develop its small fleet of balloons as an air arm. Oddly, it was a young balloonist lieutenant of the Army who finally was instrumental in obtaining a chance for the Wrights and their airplane, Frank P. Long.
After 4 long years of failing to recognize the Wrights, finally in December of 1907, the Board of Ordnance and Fortifications granted an interview to Wilbur. At once, he inspired their confidence. This led to a contract in February of 1908 between the Wright brothers and the Signal Corps. In the summer of 1908, Orville Wright brought to Fort Myer, Virginia, the airplane that was to fulfill the specifications of the contract. Day after day, we watched him fly around and around the field in his tuning up flights. And finally, on the 9th of September, he broke the world's record by staying in the air for over 1 hour. On landing, he came to me and said, "Would you like to go up?" You can guess my answer. And I made my first flight in an airplane that day with Orville Wright, 6 minutes and 40 seconds.
More than 2 decades later in Britain, despite official skepticism towards Whittle's concept, his flying instructor, Pat Johnson, thought his idea was strong and helped him patent the jet design in January 1930. Whittle was 22.
Frank Whittle's turbojet engine is an engineering marvel and absolutely fascinating. The fundamentals of the turbojet engine can be summed up in 4 stages: suck, squash, bang, blow. Air is sucked into the front of the engine and passes through the compressors. The compressors squash the air and increases the pressure. This air then moves into the combustion chamber and mixes with fuel and is ignited, and that creates the bang. This hot, high-energy air at a high velocity exits the end of the engine and creates a tremendous force that pushes the aircraft forward. As the air leaves the back of the engine, it turns turbines that are connected to the compressors, and that in turn turns the compressors. So it is a continuous system that is synchronized and works harmoniously, and this is a beautiful concept.
In January 1930, Whittle was promoted to flying officer, and 5 months later married his fiancée, Dorothy Mary Lee. During the following 2 years, they had 2 children, David and Ian. Unfortunately for Whittle's idea, in spite of its huge potential, it was comprehensively rejected by industry and the British government. And without funding, he could take it no further.
The patent became due in January 1934. Father had received a letter in November 1933 warning him and saying that he had to pay some money to renew the patent, and he didn't have any money. So, and as nobody was bothering with his idea and he wasn't getting any backing from anybody, he felt that he had to let the patent go. To renew the patent, it would cost £5. He didn't have a penny in his pocket, really, to spare. He'd enough to feed his family, and that's about all, and pay whatever had to be paid. And so he had to let it go.
I went to Cambridge in September 34 to take the mechanical sciences tripass. And being already fairly qualified, we were allowed to do that in 2 years.
It was thanks to the RAF, which continued to nurture his engineering talents.
They decided that though they'd stopped sending officers to Cambridge, that I would go. While I was at Cambridge, of course, I was learning more and more about thermodynamics and aeronautics and so forth, and polishing my ideas on the jet engine, and convincing myself more and more that it was a good idea. Except at Cambridge, I began to have doubts. I thought, is it, when you learn more, you become more aware of the difficulties. But fortunately, I didn't allow them to daunt me at that time.
So I cycle past the sign pretty much every day, go to my lectures, go to my labs, learn about some of the things that Frank Whittle would have learned about back 85 years ago. And it certainly fills me with a lot of pride and a lot of inspiration.
Well, we were talking about Grandpa coming on great-grandpa, I should say, coming on a walk along here, yeah, which is highly likely.
As a student of aeronautical engineering, Max carries on the family tradition.
It's a great pity that he didn't know that he would have a great-grandson right here in Cambridge studying engineering. He would have been so pleased, because it would have made him realise that his legacy was going to be continued.
Wife Dorothy joined Frank on graduation day to celebrate his achievement of a first-class honours degree. More than 90 years later, Ian and Max reflect on the famous family photograph.
Well, here we have my father and mother and his great-grandpa and his great-grandma standing right here outside the gates of the Senate, and when he got his degree. How about that?
It's extraordinary enough being at this university. It's such a big part of in its history, but to see it here like this, it's definitely very special. So it's lovely to see.
It is special, isn't it? Well, there you are. You can almost see yourself there.
Well, hopefully,
One day.
maybe in a couple of years' time.
One day, in a couple of years, yeah. He was trying to do the mechanical sciences in 2 years instead of the usual 3. So for the second year, when he took up with the turbojet again, took up where he left off, he was incredibly busy. And you can imagine working for a first and working on the dynamics of a turbojet engine was quite something.
By the mid-1930s, Germany was rearming. The signs of a Second World War were ominous, but the British authorities saw no role for jet technology in such a conflict. One man who did was Whittle's friend from Cranwell, Rolf Dudley Williams, who could see that a jet engine was a potential war winner. In 1935, he sent Whittle a letter.
My dear Whittle, it says, this is just a hurried note to tell you that I have just met a man who is a bit of a big noise in an engineering concern, and to whom I mentioned your invention of an aeroplane sans propeller, as it were, and who is very interested. That letter that changed the course of history because it rescued the turbojet from oblivion. Had this letter not been written, I'm not joking when I say we British simply would never have developed the turbojet.
The letter sparked the collaboration of Rolf Dudley Williams, Frank Whittle and James Collingwood Tinling, another RAF officer friend.
And they approached me with the idea of forming a company and getting on with it, and they succeeded.
the friends looked to the City of London to finance the new company. And through another pilot and engineer, Mogens Bramson, were introduced to the merchant bankers, Falcon Partners, along Old Jewry, just around the corner from the Bank of England. The bankers commissioned a report from Bramson into whether Whittle's idea was worth backing.
It was wholly favourable. Bramson, he was a pretty skillful aeronautical engineer, and his report inspired Falcon Partners to go on with the job, and they formed the company called Powerjets Limited in March 1936.
Whittle negotiated with the steam turbine company British Thomson Houston to supply the facilities that would help build his engine.
The engine became ready for running proper on April the 12th of 1937. A lot of people said it wouldn't even turn itself over. I didn't really have that doubt myself.
There were considerable technical challenges from the beginning. Nevertheless, a British jet had at last started to become a reality.
Just after the engine first ran and we'd submitted a report to the Air Ministry, this was the subject of another report by Griffith, the man who turned the job down in the early days, and his report damned it with faint praise. He brought in all the difficulties, said that no propeller meant that we wouldn't have the slipstream to help us take off, and so forth. There were several things which hampered progress, and I think that in 1937-38, the worst was the tight financial situation. Our financial backers began to get cold feet. They had, quite unrealistically, expected that within a matter of a month or two, we would have an engine capable of flying in the stratosphere. Well, of course, we had breakdown after breakdown, and they began to lose heart. And they did not produce the money that they promised. After we'd first run the engine, the Air Ministry, they did agree to a very limited contract. As soon as they gave us a contract, we came under the Official Secrets Act and couldn't raise private money. Because you can't go to people and say, look, we've got a wonderful idea, put some money into it, we can't tell you what it is. So the acceptance of a contract from the ministry virtually stopped us from raising private money.
So of course we have to bear in mind that really it was the piston engines that were the golden child of RAF and Air Ministry thought, whereas jet engines were of course a little bit more experimental, a little bit more temperamental, and so it was sort of seen as this dark horse that was an intriguing concept but would cost a lot of money and had no guarantee for success. Another factor that was against the development of jet engines and jet aircraft, of course, was the fact that they were missing the impetus in the 1930s of wartime. You know, war is a crisis, and crisis breeds necessity and innovation, and so it didn't have that same impetus. You know, it didn't have that sense of desperation to win a war. So it was sort of seen as this experimental idea that really couldn't be indulged until Britain really needed anything it could get at its disposal.
Whittle's patent was registered with the German Patent Office on the 14th of August 1931. There's a strong possibility it was seen by a brilliant young engineer called Hans von Hein studying at Göttingen University. He was encouraged to develop his own turbojet idea. Ernst Heinkel, the business giant and producer of the Luftwaffe's propeller-driven Heinkel HE-111, was eager to manufacture new engines. So when in 1936 he was approached by von Hein with the blueprint for a revolutionary new engine, he jumped at the chance. Von Hein was given access to the Heinkel company's equipment, engineers, and crucially, financial support. Within a year, von Hein's version of the jet was ready to run.
The whole development was very inexpensive, but when we would have asked for more money, we would have gotten it.
By 1939, Germany had even built the world's first jet aircraft, the Heinkel HE-178. And on the 27th of August, it was ready for its maiden flight, with test pilot Erich Wasitz at the controls.
He started and then he disappeared. And after a while he came back and we thought, oh, he's landing. He didn't. He made another round and we said, oh my God, he must like it. But we didn't have the airplane very filled up with gasoline. He landed and stopped the airplane just where Heinkel stood. And he said everything functioned beautiful and the engine worked well, and he was really himself, very enthused.
Yet this aircraft could barely fly for 10 minutes at a time and was not a success. Back in Britain, Whittle's financial struggles only got worse. By mid-1939, his project hung in the balance. Whittle was due to leave Powerjets at the end of June, and on his final day with the company, he'd one last chance to show the Air Ministry what his jet engine could do.
On June the 30th of 1939, we managed to get a big breakthrough in the attitude of the Air Ministry, in that Pye, Director of Scientific Research, came up to see the engine run, and we managed to keep it going for about 20 minutes in his presence, and he became a complete convert. So much so that he agreed that an engine for flight should be ordered, and that an aeroplane to use it should be ordered too.
That aircraft would be the Gloucester E-28-39, powered by a Whittle engine. But this new government support now made the project top secret.
The secretiveness was annoying for Mother. She couldn't understand why she wasn't allowed to talk to Father about what he was doing, because if she tried to find out what he was up to, he used to sort of steer her away from the subject. And she thought, well, I'm his wife, you know, really, I ought to know. But of course he was under constraints of the Official Secrets Acts. He absolutely could not discuss what he was doing with anybody outside the strict circle of those who were allowed to talk about it. So Mother wasn't in that, and so she felt rather annoyed about it and left out.
It would take nearly 2 more years to develop both engine and airframe. But by May 1941, Whittle's engine was ready to take to the skies. The maiden flight was set for RAF Cranwell. By chance, a young naval pilot, Eric Brown, had flown into the base the day before.
They asked me if I'd do a weather test, just to get up and see what the cloud base was. And I noticed a lot of activity from the air. I could see this activity at one hangar. Finally, around about 7 o'clock in the evening, there was furious activity at this hangar, and they eventually rolled out an aircraft, the like of which I'd never seen before, because it had no propeller, and it had an engine, when they started it up, made a rather piercing whistle.
Jerry Sayre was sitting at the end of the runway, and a party of us was sitting just to the right, and he held it on the brakes and ran out the engine to full speed, released his brakes, and then he hopped off in about 600 yards. Quite an impressive takeoff. One of my colleagues, Pat Johnson, W.E.P. Johnson, slapped me on the back. He said, "Frank, it flies." And in the tension of the moment, I rather rudely said, "That was bloody well what it was designed to do, isn't it?"
When it landed, a huge horde of people dashed over and surrounded it, and prominent amongst them was a wing commander in RAF uniform who, as I found out later, was called Whittle. And of course this was Frank Whittle himself. And although I didn't actually speak to Frank Whittle, I didn't get near him, at least I'd seen the great man.
I don't think a lot of people realise that that first flight marks the dawn of the jet age, the biggest step change in aeronautics since those flights, those adventures that the Wright brothers had in the USA in 1903. So here we are in 1941, and we're seeing a huge difference in what is going to happen in the future. This means aeroplanes, they dismissed the speed limitations of the propeller, and it dismissed the altitude limitations of the piston engine.
Whittle's jet was magnificent, a vindication of his foresight and genius.
The ministry gave us permission to open up to 17,000 just for one flight. And at that engine speed, it did 375 or 380. Anyway, it was faster than the Spitfire.
Yet Whittle's pioneering engine, the W1, still needed more work. It wasn't ready to be used in a combat aircraft. The aim was to develop the engine for a potential war winner, a twin-jet fighter that would be called the Gloucester Meteor. However, British engine manufacturers were working flat out, making piston engines for Spitfires and Hurricanes. So, the government looked to their allies across the Atlantic for support.
In 1941, of course, the international situation was very tricky. We were getting plenty of bombing, and there was obviously a pretty considerable risk that we'd be bombed out, or even have paratroopers dropping on the place. So, quite rightly, I think, they contacted the Americans with the idea of having production started in America as a backup to what was happening in England. We shipped over the engine in parts in the bomb bay of the Liberator, also with the team.
Incredible as it may seem, these crates marked the start of the development of the first jet engine in America. They contained an experimental engine which was flown to the United States from Great Britain under great secrecy in the fall of 1941. This flight was the direct result of a development in the Washington office of General Arnold a few weeks earlier. Here was the actual beginning of the jet story in America.
Gentlemen, I give you the Whittle engine. Consult all you wish. Arrive at any decision you please, just as long as General Electric accepts a contract to build 15 of them.
These were the plans of the first turbojet engine that had been successfully produced by any of the Allies. They were the results of a long, hard struggle by England's group captain, Frank Whittle. He had worked toward jet propulsion in the face of many difficulties, and he had succeeded. The Air Corps felt that jet propulsion had tremendous possibilities, and the British Air Ministry made all their information available to the United States.
Hundreds of people worked on the American jet project, but for security reasons, very few actually knew what they were building. The aerodynamic design and many mechanical features on the American version were the same as those on Whittle's engine.
The Americans did a remarkable job then, General Electric. They had that engine, their engine version of the W2B, called the Type I, on test in April of '42, so just rather less than 6 months, which is astonishing.
They would see the first faint beginning of a whole new era in the age of flight.
In the summer of 1942, Whittle was asked to support the American team with development. This included bringing updated turbojet drawings, advising on how to tackle issues with excessive gas exhaust temperatures, and sharing insights into the use of reheat to improve thrust during takeoff.
I got there just at the beginning of June and helped them. I went to Lynn under an assumed name. They insisted I use an assumed name. I called myself Whiteley because I thought if it wasn't sufficiently near my real name, I wouldn't recognize it if I was being paged or things of that kind. There were times when I forgot it, like in the hotel I would waking up, sign for my early morning coffee and forget that I was supposed to be using an assumed name and of course sign the real one.
You must have been a bit of a nightmare to security one way or another.
I'm told that that didn't matter really because the waiter was an FBI man.
Within months, the Americans had their first jet aircraft, the Bell P-59 Aerocomet, powered by an engine made by General Electric. The positivity that Whittle found in America would come to shape his own life.
It was most satisfying to see the work GE were doing because, well, they got on with the job so fast. It was remarkable. And their enthusiasm was most inspiring. And I thought at the time, if only I'd had that kind of cooperation a few years earlier, what a difference it would have made.
Yes, Father had much enthusiasm for America for quite understandable reasons. And of course they treated him so kindly and so enthusiastically when he went over there to the United States. They saw he was tired and needed a holiday, so they sent him off somewhere to have a holiday, but he soon got fed up. He could only stand doing nothing for about 24 hours, then he really wanted to get back to work. But he certainly came back from the USA, apart from having some stockings for Mother, which was great treat. He came back from the USA full of enthusiasm for what they could do over there.
Back in Britain, the aviation industry at once saw the potential of Whittle's jet. They could smell money and demanded a share in a product they'd rejected for years. The diktats of war meant Whittle, a serving officer, was compelled to share his ideas with them.
All this, of course, was putting power jets into a weaker and weaker position from the commercial point of view, and that we had to swallow because it was a wartime situation. And I and several other of my team were serving officers, and we had to put national considerations before commercial considerations. That was very dominant in my mind.
Whittle's company, Power Jets, was not allowed to make the engines for the new Gloucester Meteor. That job was assigned to Rover, a car maker.
Rovers were making an absolute nonsense of the engine. They just hadn't got the people who could do the job, and they thought they knew what to do. The situation became so bad that it looks as though there would be a complete hash of everything. The Rover were making such a poor job of the engine that the order for the production of the Meteor was cut right back.
Rover tried to redesign the engine and held up the Gloucester Meteor by 2 years.
We intended that the Rover company should be subcontractors and only subcontractors, but unfortunately they went behind our back to the ministry and tried to get direct contracts, and eventually they succeeded in doing that. And instead of being subcontractors to us, they in effect became competitors who had the advantage of having all our information handed to them on the orders of the ministry.
Eventually, the government asked Rolls-Royce to build Whittle's jet engines. This only weakened Power Jets further.
Ernest Hayes was the chief executive of Rolls-Royce, and he was responsible for the Rolls-Royce part in taking over the jet development. Of course, he had come to realise that this was the future of the aero engine. And since Rolls-Royce then were one of the most prominent aero engine firms in the world, he wasn't going to be left out. I would call him an honest rogue, because when he was going to do the dirt, he told you he was in advance. And one of the things he said to me on one occasion was, he said, "We're going to be the centre of this job, and nothing you can do will stop us."
In Germany, despite the technical limitations of the Heinkel HE-178, Hans von Hein's jet engine had galvanized industry interest, and by this time, great strides were being made. One of the most significant developments to emerge was the Messerschmitt Me-262. With combat attacks first recorded in the summer of 1944, it was a highly advanced jet aircraft, both in terms of firepower and speed.
When I tested the Me-262 at Farnborough, it had a top speed of 568 miles an hour, 125 miles an hour faster than our fastest fighter. With this sort of fighter, you could conduct combat totally on your terms. If you didn't want to engage, you could go off and leave everybody standing.
However, its development had suffered from funding setbacks and political interference, a situation not unfamiliar to Frank Whittle. The engines were also challenging, using materials with compromised heat-resistant properties, severely limiting engine life.
It was powered by the Junkers Jumo 004B engine, which had 10 hours between overhaul and after 25 hours was scrap. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way it was. If you can produce lots and lots of engines, you can have them that become scrap very quickly. It doesn't matter. But it was not a good engine. It was unreliable. It was difficult to handle.
1,400 were produced, many of the fuselages built by forced labour from concentration camps. However, few aircraft were ever airworthy at any one time, and the Me-262 failed to have a huge influence on the course of the war. In Britain, Whittle's gruelling schedule meant he turned to medication to help him both work and sleep. The pressure was taking its toll.
What you do is you build an organization, you've got a team that you've got to support, and you've got to keep everybody going. Within the team, of course, they've got a lot of problems because they're innovating as well. So it's very tough. Everybody's under an enormous amount of pressure. And of course, the key to the whole thing is that you must not, under any circumstances, let people down. You've got to keep going. You've got to fight your way through, come hell or high water.
It's secret, so he couldn't talk about it. He didn't explain to us in the family why he was getting so worked up and so maddened by what was happening. He had nobody to lean on in the family, which is a great shame. He would have liked, I think, to have at least chatted to his father or even his father-in-law, but he couldn't. That might have, in fact, helped him towards a nervous breakdown. The fact that he couldn't relieve his feelings to family or close friends.
The Gloucester Meteor finally entered service in July 1944 with Rolls-Royce engines based on Whittle's designs. By now, the Luftwaffe threat had largely disappeared. Yet the Meteor could have been ready by the start of the war, had the authorities listened to Whittle when he first conceived the turbojet in 1929. Delays that cost lives.
It is possible that the Battle of Britain could have been avoided if Britain had, say, Gloucester Meteors by May 1940, because we have to consider the fact that there is a sense of trepidation and fear that is imposed upon the enemy when they don't understand the technology that's in front of them. So if the Luftwaffe was being confronted with meteors whilst flying in their sort of slow, lumbering Dornier Dino 17s and also Heinkel HU-111s, then that really could have made a difference and an impact in terms of the fact that the Germans didn't know whether they'd bitten off more than they could chew in the Battle of Britain.
Once 1939 had passed and then we were into war, he either had to pack up his turbojet project and go and fight, as all his friends and colleagues were. They were laying their lives on the line, and he was messing about with his turbojet engine, and it gave him he felt very guilty about that. But he thought, well, what his contribution would be a jet aircraft for the RAF to use to fight the Hun. It was terribly frustrating for him, so we as a family watched his health deteriorate because of all these technological, but worst of all, the industrial skullduggery that was going on, despite the fact that we were at war. So we ended up with operational jet fighters much later than we should have done.
Many believe Britain's towns and cities would have suffered far less bombing had the Luftwaffe been met by British jet fighters. Places like Kingston upon Hull on the Yorkshire coast.
Of course, we're stood here today, the sun's out, the wind's here, it's a really nice, calm, serene view. But 80 years ago, these skies were full of Luftwaffe bombers that were attempting to devastate the city of Kingston upon Hull. And of course, the city ended up being the most bombed city out of London. So they were going for the docks, they were going for the industries and factories, and Hull really did suffer badly. But a lot of its damage was sort of negated during the war because of the fact it was just reported as this east coastal town rather than being at the absolute heart of misery and destruction.
Hull's National Picture Theatre still bears the scars today and is the last remaining World War II civilian bomb ruin that still exists. Incredibly, all 150 people inside escaped unhurt. The docks were also devastated, and little remains of the original platforms in today's rebuilt Hull, now a thriving city. Nearly 1,200 people died as a result of the German bombing campaign over Hull that lasted almost the entire war. Nighttime was especially dangerous.
Where jet fighters could have made quite a difference during the Blitz in trying to prevent the damage of cities like Hull is the fact that they really would have bolstered the RAF's night fighting capabilities. You know, they had to adapt to the Blitz very, very quickly. They had to start throwing up Beaufighters, Blenheims, Defiants in order to take on the German invaders. But if they'd had a Gloucester Meteor roaring across the Humber, you know, you've got this sense of being able to take on the bomber crews that were attacking Hull consistently each night.
By the mid-1940s, Whittle was at the height of his powers, in charge of two groundbreaking projects. A turbofan known as LR-1 or Long Range 1, and an engine for a supersonic aircraft.
The engine for the supersonic plane, the M52, was an aft fan with afterburning, all tacked onto the back end of the W2700 jet engine, and that should have been given sufficient power for the Miles M52 to do 1,000 miles an hour. I think it would have done it. And there was the LR-1 turbofan, which would have been the first turbofan in the world. I came to the conclusion that it could be the answer to a long-range bomber for the Pacific War. We also visualized it as an engine for a transatlantic aeroplane.
The turbofan is a turbojet fitted with a fan in front of the engine. Because of the large fan, this sucks in large amounts of air. A small portion of that air goes through the core of the engine and through those stages of squash, bang, and blow, and creates a thrust. But in addition to that, a large portion of the air flows on the outside of the core of the engine, the core of these components, that produces a larger thrust. We therefore have two elements of thrust generated by the turbofan. The turbofan engine is more efficient and less noisy than a turbojet engine. Most airliners today use the turbofan engine, and that is because of Frank Whittle.
In January 1944, there was a knock at the Whittle family door.
They had decided in January to make this turbojet project public. They felt that it would cheer people up if they announced the fact that we'd got jet aeroplanes flying. And so then we're sitting at home and the doorbell is ringing and there are reporters outside and photographers and so forth, which was very unsettling. I didn't understand. I mean, I was, 9 years of age. So I would be much more keen on showing the photographers my Hornby wind-up train rather than an aeroplane. But yes, apart from the publicity problem, it was one felt very proud of father, you know.
Iris Carpenter, one of the few female correspondents to cover World War II, was keen to hear Dorothy Whittle's side of the turbojet story, and she gave the only known interview about the impact of her husband's work on the couple's lives.
For 24 hours a day, he's had time for nothing but his job. I got fed up about it sometimes. What woman wouldn't? But I knew how important it was, so I didn't grumble. Hardly the man you'd expect to wake up and find famous. He had no hobbies and no other interests in his life, except his conviction that he could do what he wanted to do with aeroplanes. I have never seen him lose heart. He doesn't work at home. And of course he never talked about it once the war started. Before that there was no secret about it. As time went on, I realised how tremendously important Frank's work was becoming, so I was quite happy to make my war job looking after him. That only too often means just leaving him severely alone.
And responding to the first successful run of Whittle's engine.
A wonderful day, that. I thought that it would be the end of his experimenting. I know now there will never be an end, and I don't want there to be.
Powerjets was by now becoming increasingly marginalised as larger companies became involved in engine production. Whittle proposed to Sir Stafford Cripps, the Minister of Aircraft Production, that the whole gas turbine industry be nationalised, bringing together talent and resources.
There was a complete mess from the contractual point of view. There were no effective agreements, and no one except Powerjets had risked any money, except the government, of course. And I felt that the government, having put in $2 million, that all the companies should be nationalised, forming a collective turbojet establishment, and of course I hoped that Powerjets would be at the top of the pyramid, with myself as chief engineer.
Cripps had other ideas and nationalised Powerjets alone, downgrading its role to research and development.
So we, the people who had pioneered the whole thing, were deprived of the right to design and build engines. And that was too much for myself and my leading team members, and most of us resigned.
By now, time had also been called on the Miles M52 supersonic project.
The government panicked over the Miles 52, cancelled it, which was just absolutely atrocious. The result of this was simply that Britain lost a 10-year lead in aviation. Very interesting talking to people about that particular disaster at that time. The general view was that Whittle was becoming too powerful, and therefore he would be all-powerful if the Miles 52 had actually gone supersonic.
And believe it or not, the minister said that people wouldn't want to fly at speeds more than about 250 miles an hour.
Can you imagine what it was like to be the prime pioneer working on this technology, and these wretched government authorities just simply cancelling the whole thing, pulling the rug from underneath their feet? I think of all the disappointments that my father had. Was that not surely the worst that happened to him? And of course, he wasn't a well man anyway by then, and really this sort of thing practically destroyed the poor fellow. So the aftermath was very negative.
In many ways, I paid quite heavily for the work I did. There was the awful race against time. That dominated life. On top of all the technical difficulties, there were the financial difficulties, there was the skullduggery of people who were messing things up. And, it was frustration after frustration, and it took its toll. I began to have a series of nervous breakdowns. It was years before I really recovered my health.
Yes, that's right. He, of course, as a little boy, I just saw my father's health deteriorating, but when you are little, you don't quite understand what's going on, and Mother used to be, well, fairly reticent about it. I don't think she really understood. Nervous breakdowns in those days were almost something you would be ashamed of, and came from overwork and worry. And there's no doubt about it, the debacle with the Rover Company and the Ministry of Aircraft Production, they caused him to lose his health. How did Mother cope with his health? She'd work hard to try and get him fit again. So whenever she was in charge of the nursing at home, she would look after him up and down the stairs and so on, and looking after my brother and I as well. But she dedicated her life to us, to the family. I do remember him being hospitalised. He had terrible headaches and very bad eczema, and couldn't sleep at night. So when I'd visit him, he usually had a few pills and he was rather sleepy, but he was just very calm but pleasant. And I didn't get the impression of serious illness, actually. That was hidden from me as a child. Of course, he had a lovely tea in the afternoon with cake and stuff, and I managed to consume all his cake, I'm afraid. It was a great treat.
After resigning from Power Jets, Whittle returned to RAF duties in January 1946, where he stayed for a further 2 years. The government awarded him £100,000 for his work on the turbojet, around £4 million in today's money, which he shared with Dorothy and his fellow engineers. A few months later, Whittle retired from the RAF on medical grounds.
I don't think you and I can tell how severely he was affected with having 3 nervous breakdowns and then suddenly finding he was financially independent and so on and so forth. A lot of these things may have caused the rather gentle breakdown of his marriage to Mother. It wasn't an acrimonious separation, so it wasn't so painful, except that I suddenly found I didn't have a daddy at home when I came home from school. I can't put it into a nutshell as to why they separated. I can only think that Father was meeting so many amazing people in his travels, and he was always sent off on lecture tours, and he was going abroad and so on and so forth. Perhaps he found life at home in some way mundane. He also thought that getting outside the marriage, if he was alone, he thought his health was better, and I think he did tend to go away at times anyway. Before they separated, he tended to go away and go and stay in a club somewhere and be alone for a bit, and he seemed to find that he felt more calm.
Ian himself followed in his father's footsteps and joined the RAF to train as a pilot. As his skills developed, he was assigned to jet aircraft.
When the Meteor first started to fly, they inevitably had problems, and 1 or 2 Meteors crashed. It was a tricky aircraft on one engine. So when he found out that I was converting to fly the Meteor, he didn't really like it. He was worried. He thought his silly little boy would probably kill himself. So he was worried. I got onto an RAF squadron that was based at RAF Odium in Hampshire and flying it there. And I managed to survive. I did have my moments, I'm afraid, but I did survive.
As a civilian, not a single engine manufacturer would hire Whittle's services, but his work was having an impact he could hardly foresee. The de Havilland Comet amazed the crowds at the 1949 Farnborough Air Show. Powered by engines based on Whittle's designs, it would become the world's first jet passenger aircraft, making its maiden flight 3 years later, heralding a golden age of air travel. Something which didn't go unnoticed by the young Ian Whittle, who would eventually fly the Comet.
When I said I'm leaving the RAF to go into civil aviation, he was quite angry with me, because he thought that I would go on through and see a full career. I knew that I wasn't going to make air rank. I felt that I ought to stick to flying rather than going behind a desk. I did serve for 5 years and then left and went into civil aviation. I didn't go around from on a day-to-day basis thinking about, who's my father sort of thing, but I did have a tendency to look out of the airplane and think, those engines really are his idea, and I felt rather proud of that.
6 p.m. From now until sunset, there will be aircraft leaving and landing every 34 seconds.
The following 30 years saw huge innovations and growth in jet travel, as this American information film shows.
9 hours to Belgrade, 14 to Beirut.
Supported by cheap oil, it became a global business, with the United States and Europe emerging as industry leaders and competitors.
we could have had a much bigger influence in the war than happened. But when I see what's happened in the way of civil aviation, I can only say it's extremely satisfying, especially when you see something like the Concorde. And one of the things, you see, I never foresaw when I was working on this thing, is that I would be a passenger crossing the Atlantic in 3.5 hours. And incidentally, another thing I didn't foresee is that I would have a son who would be flying 747s as a captain.
Aviation is incredibly important. It's the world's only rapid transportation network. It enables us to travel around the world to connect with our loved ones. It allows us to experience different cultures, and this helps break down barriers. It's important for peacekeeping by being able to understand each other. Aviation also opens up markets, especially to developing countries. Millions of livelihoods depend on aviation every day, and that is because of Frank Whittle.
But it's come at a price. Today, aviation accounts for almost 3% of global CO2 emissions, and the industry is aiming to be carbon neutral by 2050.
If he was around today, he would be very interested in the alternative forms of propulsion that we're trying to introduce in order to reduce atmospheric pollution and so on. He would be fascinated.
That fascination can be found here, at Cambridge University's Whittle Laboratory.
This is just come in, only within a year, and you can see here blades being made.
Inspired by Whittle's work, the laboratory conducts pioneering award-winning research into advances in propulsion, which today is centred on reducing aviation's impact on climate breakdown.
So at medium and long-range flight, there is no real solution other than the jet engine. But the problem is the fuel we're burning and the emissions that come from those fuels. And so in the future, we're going to have sustainable aviation fuels or hydrogen.
Carries on closing the throttle, the pressure ratio keeps going up and up and up. And that's, you saw there, that was a stall.
If Frank Whittle were here today, which I wish he was, he would be equally excited by the advances they're making, and I suspect he would probably say, well, yes, we were looking forward to that form of research, and now it's happening, because he tended to be ahead of his time.
It's very important the next generation of engineers know about Frank Whittle, and that's because we face the challenge of reaching net zero carbon by 2050. And it's going to take a new generation of engineers with the same persistence and ingenuity of Whittle if we're going to get there.
So Ian, this engine here must seem like another family member to you.
Yes, I think so. I think as it was my father's baby.
As a former president of the Royal Aeronautical Society, Carissa Khan is one of those new generation of aeronautical engineers.
So this, the WU...
She's tasked with making new ideas in flight a reality, in what's being called the third aviation revolution.
We can learn a lot from Frank Whittle's experience. I'm part of the Future Flight Challenge, which is spearheading the third aviation revolution. The third aviation revolution is where we're opening up the skies to new types of vehicles. We're taking advantage of developments in technology, electrification, autonomy, artificial intelligence, digitalization. Today, the Future Flight Challenge brings government together with innovators, regulators, researchers, as well as academia and the communities that these new technologies will serve. Engaging with government early on and injecting funding is critical for innovation.
Whittle wasn't the first to arrive at the idea of a jet engine. What marks him out is that he was the first to transform that idea into a real-world machine of propulsion that would work, be safe, and last.
He was an amazing man. He was very, very tough, and he kept going. It was, of course, his personal obsession to see this thing through.
The mathematics were right. He knew it could be done. He knew the materials could be found.
He was faced with so many setbacks, and to have the character to be able to push through those setbacks and to see your technology in the world, I think was another element of his genius.
From his humble beginnings in Coventry, a city which now celebrates his life in the main square, Air Commodore Sir Frank Whittle not only changed the world, but allowed us to see what it looks like. He died on the 8th of August 1996 at his new home in the United States. A husband, a father, and the greatest aeronautical engineer of the 20th century.
When he was dying, I was over in the States and I went into his bedroom that morning. I said loudly in his very deaf ear, I said, "Dad, come on, put on your kit and let's go flying." And his eyes opened and he looked at me and he smiled. Didn't say anything. He was had dosed with morphine and stuff. And he died later on that day. And as I stood by the bed and saw him actually die, it was pretty tough for me and for stepmother. And I thought, as he died, I wonder, does he go flying now? And does he go on his own, or does he have a companion? Those were the thoughts that ran through my mind. I did feel that I was rather in his shadow. It meant that the light shone on me a little bit more than was comfortable. I felt that I had to excel at what I was doing, and I am rather dyslexic and do have some difficulties. But flying to me is easy and I'm comfortable with it. But I felt I did have to set a fairly good example, as people knew who I was and knew who he was, so I had to keep up the show a little bit. It's only through him that I managed to get into being a pilot and all the rest of it, so thank you, Dad.